But hello, everybody. This is very exciting to see you all here. My name is Allison Samuels, and I am here on behalf of the Level Up Project, which is an initiative that I began officially over the last few months, but is something that in many forms has been on my mind for years. And I am still honestly in a bit of shock that this is actually happening right now, that all of you are here, and that hundreds of people around the country and world are participating in this project, which we launched not even a month ago. It is truly humbling. Yay! Spirit fingers. I am beyond thrilled to welcome you all to our very first ever workshop week. And like, this is the second one, like ever. And supporting our vision of accessible education, knowledge sharing, and network building. All of us at the project have an innate sense that the industries we work within need to change and that we are individually responsible for helping that shift along. It is through both daily small habit changes alongside collective action that we think systems can be created to support more people. Ooh, waiting room, admit all, yes. You all in this moment are part of that creating. Oh, more people, hello, Lily. An idea that I have been returning to a lot in the last few months, articulated by activist and abolitionist Miriam Kaba, is that we don't need to build things that last forever. We should not need a project like this to exist in the first place, because free and accessible education and knowledge sharing should be baseline. I started this project as just one of many resources and stepping blocks on the way to greater equity in the physical skills-based fields of predominantly craft and design. It already feels like this project is growing and shifting to better serve everyone who would like to participate, and it has been a dream to be part of this collective building project with you all. Hello, more people. This is very exciting. Everybody's coming in. Where am I? What did I just say? Oh, yes. This model works, that is allowing everyone who wants to participate for free, including materials, because we are all collecting the dollars into one pot and then redistributing them back out. We believe that everyone contributing in accordance with their wealth and privilege is one way to achieve a more equitable social system. And it's been really exciting to watch this happen in real time as you all are making it happen by being here. We can build a framework, but if you're not here to participate, then it doesn't work. So thank you for being here. Abigail, hello. As a reminder, all proceeds from our ticket sales and donations through our website are going to Arts Business Collaborative and Map for Youth. We're just like splitting all of the proceeds to those two organizations because they're really freaking cool. And if you feel strongly about the project, we do invite you to donate through the website, levelupproject.org if you don't know already. I will be the admin for this workshop. Please feel free to drop any questions into the chat box or DM me separately if you don't want it going to the whole group. I will be turning off my video to just like focus, but we'll be collecting all of your questions and either chiming in real time if it seems pertinent to the discussion, or saving your questions till a bit later. We'll pause at about like 15 to 20 minutes towards the end of the workshop and have a period specifically for a question asking. John would love you to be participating, though since this is a big group, we do ask that you have your mics turned off unless John is directly asking for your verbal feedback. But please have your videos on that we can like see you, pretend like we're in person or something like that. And lastly, I do apologize for any technical glitches in advance. The Zoom thing is very new to me and to John. And don't hesitate to like ping me as the admin. I'm Allison Samuels. Again, if you need anything or see something not working, I will do my best to troubleshoot in real time. This workshop is also being recorded and will be available on our website after like forevermore, as long as we have a website. You'll be receiving an emailed link after, like in about a week, and that is about it. And on that note, I would love to officially welcome John Bourne, artist and designer, who started Humble Matter in 2014 after escaping from the world of advertising. Humble Matter ceramics and sculptures are available across the US and around the world. They have been featured in print and online publications. And in 2019, John had his first Humble Matter solo exhibition at the Dobrinka Saltzman Gallery in New York. That was a phenomenal exhibition, if I do say so myself. John has lived in Brooklyn since moving to New York in 1993. When he's not in the studio, John can be found running throughout Brooklyn or relaxing on the beaches of Truro, Massachusetts with his family. John has been truly humble and gracious as far as I've known him over the last few years, and I am honored that he is here with us participating in our inaugural workshop week. And on that note, I actually will be turning the floor over to John to get started.
All right, thank you so much, Allison. I'm also super honored to be a part of this project. I think it's also something I've been thinking about a lot. Probably maybe not as long as Allison has, but for a while. And of course, as is my usual fashion, a little bit more thought than there is action. So that's why I'm especially grateful that she asked me to be a part of this and be a part of this. One of the questions, and I'll try to keep this brief, but one of the questions that she asked all the participants as a lead up to why do you want to participate in doing this, and I think what I initially said was something about remaining a consciously engaged member of the community in order to support a just community. And as I've been thinking about that more, there are just a couple of other thoughts that I wanted to share that maybe help explain explain that a little bit more. One of the things is this idea of proximity. If you're familiar with Brian Stevenson, he's a equal justice advocate. He started something called the Equal Justice Initiative. He's also the author of a book called Just Mercy, which last year was made into a major motion picture starring total blank. But anyway, Just Mercy is a great book that everyone should read. But what he talks about that, when he talks about that, what he says is, without being in proximity to people, you cannot understand their experience. And that's really his link to empathy. And so for me, in terms of building community, even Allison said we can all be together like in Zoom. And so for me, even if we can't be together from a physical proximity, we can be together in an emotional proximity. And the reason why that's important is something else that I read recently was by there's an artist named George McCalman. He's an artist in San Francisco who currently has a show up and also wrote a piece for the San Francisco Chronicle where he talks about his show and the reason why he did it. And it was basically his way of reflecting back white people's emotional and apathy, reflecting it back at them because of his experience immediately following the days of the murder of George Floyd. And ultimately what he says at the end of his piece is, what he says that he cares about is that a person identifies their intimate and political responsibility to reshape the world. That is the stuff that will add actual substance to the shared dialogue moving ahead, and that is all that matters. And so those were kind of some of the things that I was thinking about in terms of community, being actively engaged, and also why I'm so glad to be a part of this project, because I feel all those things are linked. So that's why I'm excited to be a part of this project. Tonight, or whatever time it is, wherever you are, I'm going to be going through the steps that I basically go through anytime I make a piece in the studio. And these are all things you can do at home. I've personally been doing them at home for the last couple of months. Normally I work out of my basement. Tonight I'm in my dining room because the basement is a complete disaster area and the Wi-Fi is not very good down there. So I'm going to start off on a super basic level. So this may be review for some people. And if so, hopefully I'll be able to make it somewhat interesting for you. And then we'll kind of get into the exact meat of what I do. So one of the things I thought I would put out there, which honestly, until I prepared for this workshop, I didn't know, is what exactly is clay? Which may seem kind of obvious, but I thought if you don't really have any experience whatsoever with clay, it might be interesting to know. And really what it comes down to is that clay is formed from very particulate mineral particles as opposed to something like, say, soil. And the interesting thing about soil is that you think it's just dirt, basically, but soil by definition is actually has particulate matter, gas, and water. It's actually, it has to be a 3-part system to be soil, where clay does not. And so what I wanted to show, and I think this will make sense a little bit later, is this is a close-up of clay particles, like electron microscope close-up of clay particles. And hopefully you can see here, they're very flat. They're these kind of flat disc-like shapes. And you can kind of see on this part how they're sort of aligned, and then they get a little bit more disrupted here. But these are the particles that make up clay. And as I go through the demo, I'll explain why that's important, that they are those kind of platelet shapes, and what kind of effect that has on your work as you make it. So the clay that I pretty much make all my pieces out of is this. It's 420 sculpture clay. And the reason why I use this, if you're not familiar with it, is that it's really good at holding its shape. Like you can pretty much, whatever shape you put this in, it's going to stay that way through the number of times that you fire it. And if you are familiar with clay, depending on the clay you use, you probably know that as you fire different kinds of clay, depending on the heat and the pressure, the form can change. What started out maybe like this, after it gets fired, maybe it looks a little bit like that, or maybe it looks a little bit like that. Or if you have a piece that hangs over, it might bend a little bit more like that. What's amazing about this clay is you can put it in pretty much any shape and it will really stay that way. And the reason why is that it already has a lot of particulate matter built into it. It's called grog. And basically what grog is if you've ever seen like cement being poured somewhere as it comes out of a cement truck, you'll notice that it's not just gray slush, there's a lot of gravel in there. And so that's essentially kind of what the grog is. It's fired clay that's ground up, and that's what gives this its structure. So it's great for making sculpture. That's the pro. The con is that because there's all that particulate matter in there, regardless of how high you fire it, the material remains porous. So even after you glaze it, it never really remains watertight. So if you do work with a clay like this, you want it to be watertight, you'll have to find some way to seal it after it's been fired. So the first step that I always do after I have this clay, and it's basically outlined in the PDF handout, But the first thing after wedging, which I'm not going to go through tonight because it's actually a lot easier if you just watch a video online that explains what that is. And as I said in the handout, some people I know don't even really wedge what they do. They just flatten it out and get to work. But all the pieces I do start with slabs of clay. So here I have basically some plastic. I've kind of mushed out the clay that I'm starting with. I fold the plastic over, and then I have a rolling pin, and I roll it out into a slab. Back and forth like that. And basically what I've found is that with practice, you can kind of get a feel of how thick your slab is just by touch. But if you're concerned about making sure that it's an exact thickness, you can get 2 little pieces of wood to lay out and roll back and forth over that, and that will ensure a very uniform slab. So once your slab is done and rolled out, what you want to do is sorry. Sorry, I forgot one of the things. What you want to do is smooth it out. And that goes back to when I showed you that image of the particles. So basically, you have a slab of clay with a lot of particles all kind of jumbled together. And what you want to do is to start aligning those particles to build up the surface and the strength of your clay. And normally what I would use is a rubber rib like this. But in the interest of working in your home studio, what I'm instead using is the spatula from which I'm removing the top part, or if you don't have one that you can remove, you can use that. And I'm using that to smooth out the surface of the clay. And so that does 2 things. If it takes care of the texture, because if you have a plastic bag, it can kind of leave a plastic bag texture. So it does that, but it also helps to align the particles of the clay and the surface. So now you have your slab, and you have it smoothed out, but it's still very mushy. Like you can see, you can press into it very easily. So it doesn't have very much strength. It's still very flexible. And I personally, before I start using it, I like to be a little firmer than that. So that's where your fan comes in. Otherwise, if you just leave this out, you'll be waiting a long time for it to firm up. So I plug in my fan, I take my slab, and I set it in front of the fan. And then after about 10 to 15 minutes or so, depending on how close the fan is, how high the fan is, how humid the room is, you end up with a slab like this. It's a lot stiffer. And I usually think of this stiffness as if you have like a leather belt, it's kind of like that. It's kind of flexible, not too hard, so you can see that you can still kind of bend it, but it's not as mushy as it was before. So now that you have that slab, what we're going to do is we're going to take that and start forming things. And so what I'm going to use tonight is this bowl, this glass ramekin, and this green plastic cup. And how did I decide that those were the three objects I was going to use? As I tell everyone, about 90% of the pieces I make, I try to plan out ahead of time. And to do that, I just do a little drawing. So I'm kind of like, oh. And if you can't draw that well, you can do like a really rough kind of sketch just to kind of get the outline. And that way you can look at it and be like, do I like this combination of objects? Should this middle bowl, would that be better if maybe I chose a larger bowl? And then you can do sketches before you get into the arduous process of putting everything together. But I've decided for the purposes of tonight, we're going to keep it simple. It's going to be these three things. So a word about objects. I'm a big fan of nesting bowls. This set in particular is great because they have a flat bottom. They're flat on the inside. And I'll talk about why that kind of makes things easier later on. But the reason why nesting bowls are great is when you get into designing things, you already have like kind of built-in graduations for things. And in terms of like hierarchies, so you can have a nice like and you already have things proportionally sized to one another. So they're like kind of fewer decisions and things you need to worry about making. So I'm going to start with this bowl, and I have another piece of plastic here. And I just put the plastic in this bowl. Some people prefer using cornstarch because basically the plastic is there as a release. I don't like cornstarch just because it's like another powder and it's like another thing to add. But some people prefer using that. And then what I'm going to do is I have my slab, I have my bowl, and normally what I use is this. This is called a fettling knife. But for our purposes tonight, if you just have like a paring knife, and it doesn't have to be a good one. In fact, it's probably better if it's cheaper. I bought this one at the 99-cent store for 99 cents. And what you're going to do is cut your slab up and press it into this bowl. So I am taking this piece of clay and pressing it into the bowl. Another thing that you can do, and probably some of you who work with clay do this, if you suddenly decide that you love this vase, or you have an order to make like 20 of these vases from one place, rather than kind of randomly cutting up pieces, you can actually cut up a pattern of the pieces that you need for this. And that way it makes it easier, and also you end up wasting less clay cutting it out. But tonight I'm just going to cut out some random pieces and press them into this bowl. Okay, so I have them kind of loosely pressed in there. You'll notice I haven't done it all the way to the bottom. You don't really need to do that because that part's going to be removed anyway. So once you kind of have them in there, you want to make sure that they're pressed in as much as you can, and then also the seams where they overlapped, you want to smooth those out, because that will help ensure the integrity of the inside of your piece. So once you have that pressed in, you then take your knife again, and I would use the blunt edge. You don't really need to use the sharper edge. And then you go around and you cut off your excess clay. And then depending on where you're working, if you're working in a studio, you might have a bucket where you throw this, and then eventually you can, after it dries out, you can add water to it and turn it back into clay. If you're working at home, you can just put it in a plastic bag, or you can put it in a bucket there as well. It really kind of depends on space considerations for what you end up doing with this. I still have bags of this stuff in my basement from like 2 years ago when I was working full time out of my basement that I never got around to reclaiming. So you might want to think about that, like how realistic it is for you to reclaim. Throwing out clay isn't a big deal. As I say in my sheet, clay itself is actually pretty inexpensive. It's just the shipping costs that make it expensive. So that's another consideration for you in terms of how much work you want to put into reclaiming your own clay. So now we have basically a bowl inside of a bowl. Because we're doing this design, this basically requires us to have 3 of these bowl shapes, 1 ramekin and 1 green glass. What I like to do for the top edge of this bowl, before I'm done, I like to add an extra coil of clay. And I do that because when you put the 2 halves of the bowls together to make your ball, I like to have an extra edge along there to connect them. So I've added my coil, I built out my edge. So now we have one of our components done. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our friend the fan. We're going to take this guy out, and we're going to dry this, because right now, if you try to put this together, you're gonna have a really hard time because it's still very flexible. So we're gonna set this aside and dry this. Until it's only like this flexible, which is normally what people call leather hard. I know I used the belt metaphor earlier, but which is a little bit softer than quote leather hard, but that's basically what this is. So once these are dry, you'll notice in making some of your shapes that you'll have creases on the outside where your slabs didn't come together. So you can address that at a couple of different points in making things. I like to do it at this point because I like to have all my pieces kind of nice and ready to go, and then I just kind of stack them all up and attach them, and I'm done. So at this point, this is where your lazy Susan comes in. And I think you can still get these. I saw them at Target a couple months ago. They were wooden. This one I think might be from IKEA. This year, I think it looked like Glenn was laughing, but I've actually been in clay studios where they use these on the regular. So it's an at-home hack, but it's also a real thing. As I say in the handout though, this is where it's at. Like if you can afford to get one of these, or if you're like, this is gonna become a real thing for me, this is what you wanna invest in, because these things are the bomb. This is called the banding wheel. This one's made by Shimpo. Ceramic Supply, I don't think Ceramic Supply doesn't make their own version anymore. But this is like a really beautiful, heavy weighted, spins beautifully, great thing. But if you're not doing that, this is perfectly adequate. And it makes kind of a fun like maraca sound. So it adds like, that kind of adds more of a party atmosphere, I guess, to doing what you're doing. So there are a couple options that I'm trying out instead of this guy. And this was also on the tools list in terms of a scoring tool. This is really like the best scoring tool there is, I think. I wish that I was like a ZM Tools influencer person, because I really love these tools. I think they're great. But regardless, tonight we're going to try a couple of other things. So first is the broken part of a comb. And what we're trying to achieve is we're trying to get rid of these spaces. So this is, I think this is a good point to interject a brief note about aesthetics. You, as a maker, may decide that you love the way this looks. There have been a couple times where I've been like, it would be really interesting to do a whole series where you kind of left these in, depending on how you finished your piece. It could look really lovely. And from a structural standpoint, if you've done a good enough job smoothing the inside of your piece, this is not really gonna matter. It's not gonna like crack and burst when you fire it. So I'm taking you through the steps that I do based on the kind of aesthetics I wanna achieve. You as a maker, an artist, whatever, may decide that that's not what you want to do, which by the way is awesome. One of the great things about ceramics is you can do pretty much whatever you want and find an audience and find people who will think that you're doing amazing work, which is very satisfying. And I think it's like that's an important distinction. Like you might at the end of this tutorial be like, that was really interesting, John, thanks for that information, but none of that like really connected with me. And I think it's important to note that there's so many different ways to make ceramics that if you leave this demo and are still interested in ceramics, but don't really feel like this is the way for you to make them, I still would encourage you to explore other ways, because this is just the way that I found it works for me, and it plays into a lot of my own personal idiosyncrasies. Many people in my family will tell you that I'm a perfectionist. So therefore, it plays to those kind of issues that I personally have. So it works for me. And I like the things that I make. So at the end of the day, there are a whole number of audiences, right, who you're making things for. You're making things for yourself, first and foremost. You have to love what you make. Like, you could be very strategic about it and be like, okay, I've looked at Instagram or whatever, people seem to love X, I'm gonna sit down and make like a bunch of X things and it'll be great. And that might be fine. And if that works for you, again, that's awesome. But I really feel like first and foremost, you have to love what you're making. And then after that, it's up to you to decide like who your audience is and what kind of feedback you care about. Lots of people could chime in and be like, well, what you make are lumpy and awful, and it doesn't even look like you know what you're doing. And at the end of the day, it's up to you to decide if that feedback is important to you or not as a maker. And then adjust what you're doing accordingly. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm scoring across these overlaps with this fork. And then let's see, we'll try the comb over here. Comb isn't great. I'm just gonna say right off the bat. Well, maybe that's okay. And then the other crazy thing I found was this is actually a pet grooming comb. This was also at the 99-cent store. And it seemed like that also might be an option, but that's not that great either. So then what we want to do, the first step of filling these in is, this is slip. And this is basically just a combination of water and clay. It's really watered down thin clay. And you kind of dab that where you scored either side. And then you're gonna take some more clay, just clay out of the bag. You're gonna roll it into coils, and you're gonna press it in those seams.
And John, Emily asks how long it takes from a piece to go from wet clay to ready to score like this. She missed that part. And apparently I did too.
Yeah. Sorry. Unfortunately, I don't have a really good answer to that. People often ask me how long it takes to make a piece. I also don't really have a good answer to that. So from starting out with just like clay to get to this point is probably after you like roll it out and let it dry. This is probably like maybe a half an hour before you're doing this, give or take, depending on fan speed. So then, normally I'd use this it's basically a wooden tool. I don't actually know what this is called. One of my assistants called it the magic wand, which I thought was a great name. So I'm going to call it the magic wand. But tonight we're using the handle from our spatula. And so you're smoothing the clay that you just put on into that overlap. So basically this is just a way of filling in those creases. That's what we're doing so that the whole outside of this is smooth.
John, is there a way to raise that piece up a little bit more into the light? It's a little hard to, yeah, there we go.
Oh, sorry. Okay. So once you've kind of pressed it in, then what I do is I take a little more slip and brush it on. And then I take my spatula rib and I smooth up the edges. So if you think back to that original photo I showed of the kind of the molecular structure of the clay, and there was that one section where they're kind of all neatly stacked, and then that other section where they're all kind of disrupted. So we're trying to ensure that they're neatly stacked, even though we've just disrupted them. And one of the things that you will often hear people who work, or ceramicists or potters, say about clay is that clay has a memory. And I think that's because on that molecular level, once the platelets start to get aligned, and then they get pulled apart by something that you've done, on some level, there's always going to be some touch of that original alignment or that first thing that you've done. So I'm saying that because as I've smoothed this out, right, I think, wow, I've done like such a great job. You can't even tell that those overlaps were there, right? But what you will discover is that after, I don't know what I just did there, maybe a minute of smoothing that, you put this piece together and fire it, you will still see where some of those overlaps were. So this is like one of those stages where I'm probably not going to spend the amount of time on it tonight that I normally would, but the more time you spend compacting the clay and aligning those platelets at this stage, the less likely you are to see any vestiges of the work that you did putting those slabs together. All right, so now we have, in theory, we've done this with all our components. We've done it with our bowls. Oops, there we go. So we have those 3 bowl shapes that we needed. We've done it with the bottom, the base, the ramekin. We just finished doing it with this. What you may need to do at this stage, after you've smoothed out any imperfections, is you may need to hit these with a fan again, because depending on how much you worked on them, the clay might have gotten a little soft. But in this case, this still feels pretty solid. So I'm gonna move ahead. So now that we have all our components, we're ready to put them together to form our vase. And so the bottom, to create the bottom, we're also going to need a slab of clay. And we're basically going to do what I did on the outside of this, but on each one of these to put them together. So if you, the first thing that I do is I have this stamp. So I stamp the bottom of each one of my things before I start. If you don't have a stamp, you can use you can use your knife, which I did for years, and you can carve in your name, or just if you have some kind of mark that you like to make, you can do that. So I have my bottom. This, by the way, is it's like super stiff. It's like, just like the level before you would start to say, oh, that's dry. So I put a little slip around the edge of that. I put a little slip around the edge of that bottom ramekin. I take my fork or your scoring tool, or honestly, I've even just used a knife, and you make marks all along the edge of your bottom piece. So basically what you're doing is you're opening grooves on this piece and opening grooves on this piece, so that when they go together, that clay will mesh mix together and, you know, as much as it can become like one clay thing again. So I'm doing that along here as well. And so that's called scoring. And then I put slip on the edge of that guy. And then I press it onto the bottom. So now those two guys have started attaching them. And then either with your magic wand or your somewhat less magic wand, you go along the edge and you really press them together. And part of the reason I like the clay pieces to be pretty dry is so that they can withstand the pressure of pressing these two things together. So I do that, and then I will also go over it with my rubber rib. And so I've done it one way, and then what I will do is I flip it over and I press, so I'm kind of pressing one thing down, and then I'm pressing this other edge down over that bottom piece. So it's kind of connected like that. And now you're probably thinking, wow, that looks kind of like garbage, which it sort of does. So whenever people ask me, like, I've had a few people work for me and they're always like, well, what are the points that I should focus on? Like, what are the things you look for? And I look at kind of like three, I lie and say I look at like three things, but honestly, I'm looking at everything. But I start out by trying to make it simple. You're like, you're looking at these three main things. So, but one of the things is the bottom edge. So the nice thing about a banding wheel is that it has these grooves built in that really help you follow the circular thing if you're making a circular piece. But I do try to focus on that edge. So if there's extra clay, this is the point at which you can take your knife.
Can you move the camera down a little bit?
Oh, sorry. Take your knife and cut off the extra. Right? So that's looking a little bit rounder. Like pretty circular. And then what I do is, so I pushed this down last time, then I bring any excess up like this. I'm kind of pushing it down one way and then pulling it back up the other way to close it off. Okay, so that's pretty set. And then usually what I do is I will take my rib then and go around it and smooth out that connection. And what you may find at this point is there may be some areas where you need to just like fill in with a little clay, just a little clay for parts that aren't as even. If, as I said, that's something that you're worrying about in your practice. Okay. And so now the bottom part is all but done. This is still a little raggedy. So then I flip it over and basically hold this at like a 45-degree angle and smooth out that sharp edge. And the reason I do that is because in my experience, both my own and working at other studios, super sharp edges like that at the bottom of your piece have a tendency to get chipped all the time, even with the best, most careful people loading a kiln, that including myself. So if you do like that kind of razor sharp bottom edge, please note that it's often prone to ending up a little chipped. So there's my kind of less than razor sharp smoothed out edge. So a couple of things you'll notice on here, like this is still a little rough around here. And that is honestly not one of the things I super care about. The texture of the piece I personally like, as I feel it adds like a little character. I'm much more concerned with it being like an overall cohesive form. So basically what comes next is, you can really kind of see, you can't because the camera's not on it, now you can, that this is how your piece would come together, right? You'd stack all those components and connect. And that's why when I talked about those stacking bowls that have the flat top, that's why these are nice, because it makes it easy to connect things evenly. So basically what I just did for the bottom, we're gonna do for every stage moving up. So I'm gonna cut off any excess here. And then it's like a final touch. Can't really light the inside, but I just go around inside and smooth out any clay or slip that is snuck in there. This piece, cut the hole in that. I leave about 1/4 of an inch of a lip because that's what's going to connect those two. And then put some slip on that edge. Put some slip on that edge. Score it. Score that. Take a little more slip. And then I press those two things together. And this is where having the banding wheel or something to spin comes in handy, because you can see as you spin around how centered or not centered you've gotten those things. So once you think you've gotten it pretty much to the center, I pinch those two things together, those two edges that we created. And then I also,
Can you raise the camera up a little bit, John?
oh, sorry. Oh, there we go. I also smooth that connection out on the inside, which also helps connect those two pieces. So the last thing we do before we move on to adding the next component is this seam where the two meet. You want to score in there if you can. maybe your knife is a good tool because the tip can get in there. And then we're gonna fill that in, some more clay, make a coil. Oops. And fit the coil in there. And this is where, if you have some of these nice ribs that have like a nice point on it, that can really come in handy. This spatula is actually seems like it's pretty decent because it's got that point. So then I smooth that out. So that is helping both aesthetically, if you want to have it seem like a real cohesive piece, because you lose that. And then what I'll do is brush that again. You're pushing part of it down and then the other part down. So that way it seems like more of a cohesive piece and less like you just stuck two clay components together. So it helps aesthetically, and then it also helps structurally because you filled in that connection point. And these connection points actually will, if you don't make them secure, your piece will crack there and come apart when it gets fired. Okay. There we go. Then, so our next piece, so this is where it comes in handy that you have that extra edge. I personally find making round circular balls to be like deceptively difficult, especially depending on the kind of clay you're using. This stuff I find to be fairly helpful because it holds its shape, but I've worked with other clay that has less structure, and you can kind of end up with more, or rather less, round things. But again, part of that goes to your own personal aesthetic preference. So I've done the same thing we've been doing. I put some slip, I scored it, and now I'm going to take some slip and put it on the edge of both pieces. And I'm going to stick them together. And I'm pressing pretty hard. Like I'm pressing hard enough. I don't know if you can see that the slip kind of squeezes out the seam. And that's like another reason too that it's helpful to have your clay be pretty set up, because especially at this stage when you're pressing these two balls together, they can get kind of mushy, and then you're nice. Like you could see at this point, hopefully maybe, like it's actually pretty good. Like from a distance, you'd be like, wow, that looks like you just made a perfect sphere. But if it's not set up, the more you work on this, the kind of wonkier it'll get. So then generally what I do is I score the seam, because depending on what you're trying to do, honestly, I could totally see a world in which you're like, oh, it would really be cool to have a sphere with that seam running around it, and you could have like 3 stacked spheres, each one with a seam. Like, so that's, and some people actually, when they do their coil here, they'll like pinch it a little bit and to accentuate that. So again, a lot of it really is your personal aesthetic decisions about how you want your piece to look. But for this piece, I want it to look like this perfect little sphere. So I've made like a really thin coil, like a mouse tail kind of, and I'm just adding that where that seam is, because this is another case of clay having a memory. Like you'll think that you've kind of pushed these two things together and done a really good job of smoothing it out, and then it'll fire and you'll be like, oh, still kind of see the seam there a little bit, huh? So I've done like a little mouse tail all the way around that seam. And then smooth it down one way. And I smooth it, okay, good. I smooth it up the other way. And then I go around with my rib and I kind of flatten that out. And then I'll kind of pull, I'll kind of do a series of, you can tell how much I love the Lazy Susan. Like in theory, I'm like, yeah, people do that all the time. And I'm just like, no, I'm just turning the piece. Like I don't even have a Lazy Susan there. So you know what? Maybe Lazy Susan isn't so great. So I'll basically go around smoothing it up and then sort of the opposite direction. I'll smooth it down to spread out that coil. And then it's sort of do it a little above where that hit. Smooth that out, and then a little below. And this is, again, one of those points where you can like totally go down a rabbit hole. And I've straight up spent like 20 minutes, half an hour going over that seam, because I'll be like, I'll do it one way and I'll turn it and I'll be like, oh, that made the bottom part bigger than the top part. And then I'll have to smooth that out. And then I'll be like, oh, that made that left, like when you look at it there, it doesn't look round at all. And so it's like, this is one of those places where you just need to kind of be careful and check yourself, because you can lose like an entire afternoon trying to create this little sphere. So I think what I'm gonna do, because we have like 20 minutes left, I'm gonna make an artistic decision and choose not to add the top layer. I am gonna say one thing about that though, because I mean, that's still pretty good, right? Like that's like a valid design. The one thing I wanted to say though, about clay and flat surfaces. So this is not a very big, what is this? This is like 2.5 or 3 inches across. So in my experience, and this is a point at which any other like experienced clay people feel free to chime in. Clay does not like expanses of flatness. Something this size I've found, especially with this clay, is perfectly fine as long as you make this like really dry before you attach it. Because otherwise what will happen is you'll attach this and this won't be fully dry, and then you'll try to attach this piece and you'll push down and the whole thing will kind of collapse, and then you're like trying to add clay to even it out, and again you're just sort of like, that was a little bit of a nightmare. So one thing to keep in mind if working with flat things, like the bigger, like if we were using, so this is the next size up bowl, like if we were going to do this as a flat thing, I would definitely build in, oh, sorry. I would definitely build in some supports to support that expansive clay, because if you're setting something else on top of that, it's likely that this will warp or something when it gets fired. But something this size, as long as this is really firmed up, should be fine to use. But since we redesigned our piece on the fly, again, why these things are nice, this flat surface makes it a lot easier to add your next piece, because you don't have to be like, oh, it's perfectly round. Is it, is it centered? Is it off? What's going on there? So we're doing the same. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to cut out the center part, but we're going to leave like a 1/4 inch lip there, because that's what the top part of the vase is going to rest on. And then before I add another piece, what I do is I try to go in with my finger, and on the inside where that seam was, I try to smooth out that seam. And you'll find that you got to be careful pushing. I don't know if you can see. I don't know if you can see that, but if you push too hard, you'll push out too far. So I just kind of try to push down. And again, that is both like a structural thing, and that clay is a memory thing, because I've found that if you kind of smooth that seam out on the inside as much as possible, it'll show up less on the outside of your piece. So,
John, before you continue, everyone, if you have any questions, if you want to drop them in the chat box, I will keep track, and we will get to questions in about like 3-ish minutes.
Okay, so same thing we've been doing all along. Add a little slip. Score that edge. We're doing the same on this guy. Okay, and then we just press this on. Pretty, like, again, if your clay is set up enough, you can be pretty hard, like pushing this guy down, and you're fine. So you're like, oh, great. This again is where the spinning comes in handy. Make sure it's centered. This actually looks pretty good. And then, so the last sort of finishing touches are inside. You're not going to be able to see. I'm just going to tell you. You need to take whatever your tool is to go inside and smooth out that seam on the inside. Because this is generally kind of a weak connection point. So I try to do as much as I can with that tool to smooth it out. And then I do the same thing on this seam here, where you score it. And then you take some clay, you make another coil, and you add that. So this is another interesting place where, as you get into this and really kind of start to play with what you're doing, so you could take a very I don't know, conservative approach, I guess, and use as little clay as possible because you want to really preserve the roundness of that ball, that sphere that you worked so hard and diligently to make.
Effie asks if slip is needed here.
So in doing this, I always, before I add a coil, unless your clay is really soft, I always, do like slip around, unless of course I didn't just do that. This clay is pretty soft. But if your clay is pretty soft, you don't have to do it. But if it's stiffer, then yeah, I mean, I usually feel like adding slip can't hurt. So if you take most of that clay off, you still, and then smooth out your work, you have this really nice sphere. But you could suddenly look at this and be like, oh, wait, if I took more clay and I made that bigger, I could totally kind of change the character of my piece. And yeah, I realized that I didn't add any slip there. Sorry.
Miriam asks, what was the clay and what temperature do you fire your work?
Oh, the clay is, it's made by Standard, which is the clay that's stocked by Ceramic Supply in New Jersey. It's called 420 sculpture clay. It's fired to cone 6. And by adding more clay, then you can suddenly have a different kind of thing going on, right? Because you're smoothing that big collar of clay, and it's less about it being this kind of sphere and more about being this kind of smooth teardrop shape. And so that's that, and you can do that. See, like, it totally, to me at least, maybe you're all just like, I don't even notice what you did, but like that to me completely changed. Like it was this very like do, and now it's very smooth. And you can honestly, if suddenly we're making this kind of maybe like swoopier shape, you could add that down here too.
So John,
Yeah.
as you are finessing your shape, I would love
Yeah.
to get to a couple of questions.
Sure.
Is that cool with you?
Yeah, go.
Amazing. Okay, so Lauren asks what your thoughts are on self-hardening clay, and is there oh my goodness, and is there an at-home alternative to the firing glazing process?
So I don't really know it. I'm going to be like totally honest. I don't really know anything about self-hardening clay. I'm sorry. I've never used it for anything. So honestly, your best bet would, I don't know. Sorry, you just have, I feel bad like that suddenly you revealed this gaping like hole in my clay knowledge. But in all honesty, my clay knowledge is already filled with gaping holes, so just like add another one to the list.
Emily asks if there is a way to make this clay watertight.
So yeah.
Sealant, does glaze do the sealing?
So this clay, in my experience, you need to there are a couple things you can do to help. Yeah. So now we have, you can't see the bottom, but now we have a much kind of less angular, kind of nice, like softly curved thing. And I only say that because it just kind of expands the palette of like what you can do with the same shapes. Like you can make like two different vases using the same shapes. So the other person I know who like does a ton of work with this clay, her name's Simone Bodmer Turner, and she used to use this clay like for all her vessels, and I was always kind of like, how do you make that work? And she apparently did loads of burnishing, which is after the clay gets a little like this top part is almost ready, is like you just go over it a lot. And so basically the constant burnishing is compacting all those platelets of clay over and over. So you're helping to compact it. And she glazed the inside and the outside of her pieces. I know I don't really glaze the outside of my pieces. And she said she had some luck with that. So what I do is every piece I make like this that needs to be watertight, I polyurethane the inside.
Melora asks if you can put a porcelain slip inside to make it watertight.
That's kind of a good idea. Maybe you could, yeah. I haven't tried that. The only thing you would probably need to be mindful of is you have to dry it really slowly, because I think the porcelain's going to dry at a different rate than this, and also when you fire it, it's just like how those two clays interact and do they really stick together. So you could experiment and try that. Yes, that would be an option.
And please, and everybody, we have about 5 minutes left, so feel free to stick your questions in the chat box or DM me separately.
The other thing I will say is one of the other reasons I kind of chose this form is if you want to use a clay where you don't actually have to worry about it being watertight, like if you want to use like just a regular stoneware clay, like what somebody would use to throw on the wheel or something like that, you could totally make this piece with that. It's very vertical, especially you're like smoothing out a lot of your connections, so you're adding a lot of stability to it. It's just like one of those things, like depending on the pieces you want to make, you just need to think about what you're asking the clay to do and if it's good at doing that. So if you're making a really sculptural piece using like a clay that has less structure in it, you just have to be willing to accept the fact that it may move and change as you fire it. So these are, which is not to say that it's a bad thing to do. These are just the things you need to be mindful of. Like if you want to make something and have it look like whatever, 90%, 95% the way it looked when you finished making it like this, come out of the kiln, you need to think about the shape you're asking the clay to make. Like I said, you totally handled the shape in stoneware, and it'll look like this because you're not asking it to do any of these things, and it's very stable. So generally, in my experience, like the simpler your shape is, and the less kind of parts that you're asking it to move. If you use stoneware, you'll probably be fine. But if you are asking the clay to do other things, then it's basically like the clay is designed and wants to do certain things. And if you ask it to do other things, they're just going to be trade-offs. So like this wants to be a nice sculpture. I'm asking it to be a vase. The trade-off is I have to seal it because it doesn't want, the structure is more porous. It's just that. And part of it literally just comes down to, experimentation and what trade-offs you, again, as an artist are willing to have. I came to the conclusion that I wasn't making like that many, don't get me wrong, it's a pain to polyurethane the inside of the base that you make. But I came to the conclusion that I wasn't making like 4,000 bases, so I would accept that because things turned out the way I wanted them to turn out. If I was suddenly like making 4,000 bases, I'd probably rethink that and rethink what some of my designs were so I could make them in a different kind of clay where I wouldn't have to do that. So hopefully that's helpful and clear. The last thing, unless people have other questions, if I will say that in the handout, I've listed a couple of studios that and basically that kind of comes down to the studios I'm familiar with. I mean, depending on where you happen to live, there are a lot of them in New York. From what I've heard from other people that I've talked to who are not at those studios I listed, they're small. There's a certain amount of social distancing going on, so there's limited access. In Brooklyn, I've kind of listed them in terms of small, medium, and large. I work out of Wedge, which is a smaller studio. That said, they still have space for memberships. They just included a new work-at-home membership level. Brooklyn Clay has a work-at-home membership level. Gasworks has a bunch of different memberships. The other thing about Gasworks is they have their own educational nonprofit. Those guys I know are very, very dedicated to making clay as accessible as possible. I don't know, you'd have to do like a little investigation exactly how you fit into that. But I do know that everybody, that I've talked to at Wedge, Gasworks, and Brooklyn Clay is working hard to make safe environments and make it as affordable as they can for people to fire there, whether you're a full-time member there or just like a drop-off member. So those are some of the resources in New York. If you live someplace else and you're like, could you help me find someplace to fire wherever you live? If I know if you want to email me, and if I know somebody around there, I'm happy to connect you with them. I mean, I know who I know, so I'm happy to do that. And yeah, hopefully as the Level Up project progresses, I'm trying to work out ways to do more kind of community oriented firings and stuff like that too. I'll be honest, that's like a couple of months down the line. But again, if you're in New York City or Brooklyn, that is something that I'm like actively working towards.
Lauren asks, what are some game changers you've found in building your studio, like specific tools to invest in, methods of organization, or other hot tips? And in a minute or less, please go.
So I feel like so for me, I'll be honest, game changers was like switching to this clay. I had been at Brick House Ceramic Arts Center in Queens, which is part of their membership provided you with studio clay. So I was like, yay, cost cutting measure, use the studio clay, which is a brown stoneware clay. It's perfectly nice. But again, it's that idea of if you're asking the clay to do something, it didn't really work out with some of the things I was doing. And somebody there was like, oh, you should try this. You'll never, and they were right, I did. So again, I think a game changer, like you need to find the clay that works for what you're trying to do. If you're a hand builder, I think like I said, investing in a banding wheel is amazing. And yeah, I mean, I feel like a lot of studio honestly, making patterns, again, as I said, if you're going to make like a lot of these shapes, it's a lot easier to have that pattern cut that out of clay and stick it in there and smooth it around. Cool. And honestly, to me, and I say this all the time, and people kind of like shake their heads and they're like, "Oh, you're just being humble," but honestly, I firmly believe that anybody can do what I do if you have time and are patient, you know, you can make this equally as well as I just made it, and you will have a like. I mean, if you think this is nice, I'm not going to say you'll have a beautiful vase. And you're all like, I hate that. But if you like this, then you'll have a beautiful vase. So honestly, I find that you know, slowing down and taking your time and not rushing things is a game changer from as a maker. Because I feel like depending on the person you are, and if this is a hobby for you and your limited time, this is the way I was. I was always like, okay, I have 3 hours. I'm gonna do as much as I can in those 3 hours. And I was like a crazy person trying to make stuff. But if you know, if you can take that part out and really focus on what you're doing and be patient, you're gonna just love your results so much better than if you like, you know, try to do like crazy 3-hour person, whatever thing. So there you go.
Thank you, John.
Yes.
Thanks, Nana. Just saying, Audrey and Effie both had some tips that we will email out to you after. I'll have John rather email you all. Audrey found a banding wheel, an affordable banding wheel, and Effie going to Brooklyn Clay for 25-pound bags, and they have free pickup or $10 delivery if you're in Brooklyn. Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
Just a reminder, you'll receive a link to this workshop, which we have recorded. It will be emailed to you in about a week after the workshop. It'll also live on our website like forever, so you can like keep accessing it. We also have the PDF that John sent to you, which will be living on our website, also translated into Spanish, which thank you, John, for helping us get Spanish translations for all of our PDFs. John, before we leave, everybody I'm imagining, or most people are here because you have invited them in some way, but how can people keep up with you? What's the best way to find your work?
I mean, Instagram is the best way to find my work if you want to keep up. Also, I was really serious about what I said at the beginning and making connections. So, you know, anybody who registered for this workshop, if you at any point have any other questions, my email is on the handout. You can DM me on Instagram. There's no question if I know the answer to that I won't share with you. As I said, there's nothing magical about what I'm doing here, so I'm always happy to, if there's anything that I know how to do, share that with you.
Thank you. And I want to echo that on John's end. He is pretty great about sharing all of the resources all of the time with anybody. Thank you all so much for being here. Please feel free, if you want to join in other workshops for the rest of the week, you're welcome to sign up as like purchase a donation ticket on our Eventbrite page. You won't receive any material packets anymore, but you're welcome to just like join in. Also sign up for our mailing list for future sessions. I think we'll be doing one in December, so I'm like knocking on all the wood right now. Thank you again, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it. Nice to see you.
Bye.
Bye.